All right. Hello, and thank you for joining us. Today's webinar is entitled Getting on Board, the Four Roles of Library Trustees, presented by Cathi Alloway. My name is Linda Reynolds, the Public Library Management Consultant for the State Library of North Carolina, and I am your host today. And I will be joined by my colleague, Lauren Cathi, the Continuing Education Consultant. During the training, I ask you to stay muted and turn your cameras off unless you are asked to participate by the presenter. We do have a few polls today that you will be invited to participate in. And when you have questions or comments, please type those in the chat box and they will be addressed. If you have any technology challenges, please feel free to send Lauren Cathi a private chat message and she will help you troubleshoot. Today's webinar is being recorded and the recording will be available in the State Library of North Carolina Niche Academy portal, and we will also share a copy of the recording with registered participants. This event is made possible in part by a Library Services and Technology Act grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, administered by the State Library of North Carolina. The views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this presentation do not necessarily represent those of the Institute of Museum and Library Services or the State Library of North Carolina. Before introducing our presenter, I just want to do a quick poll to get an idea of who's in the room and what type of board your library has, advisory or governing. So I'm going to launch that poll and ask you to make the appropriate response. And we'll close the poll here in just a moment. All right, and I'll share the results. Looks like the majority are advisory. There are some governing and there are a few not sure. So that'll be great for Cathi to tackle that for all of us. I'm going to stop sharing that. And I am going to introduce our presenter today. Cathi Alloway has over 30 years of library management experience, primarily in Pennsylvania, where she recently retired as director of the SCLO Center Region Library in State College. Her professional interests are in board development, strategic planning, and fundraising. Cathi has served as president of the Pennsylvania Library Association and has been active in library and community leadership training programs. She holds a bachelor's degree and a master's of library science from the University of Michigan. I will turn it over to you, Cathi.
Thank you, and welcome to everyone in North Carolina. I am really honored to be here today, and I'm going to start sharing my screen fairly quickly, and we'll give you a preview of what we'll be doing in the next 60 to 90 minutes, and we're going to go down this road together, so welcome. Really great to be here today. The first thing I would like to do is thank you for volunteering to be a library trustee. You're community leaders who are participating in the work of a really vital resource in our nation. Free and open public libraries. They are really amazing things, and you are helping libraries thrive in offering essential education, recreational, and social services in all of North Carolina's neighborhoods, towns, cities, and counties. This presentation today is going to offer a slightly different view of the information that you have in some important resources available to you from the State Library, particularly the North Carolina Public Library Manual, which I will be referring to. What I want to do today is cover these 4 points, but I'm going to present it in a framework that talks about 4 roles that trustees play, or different hats that you're going to wear. It's a framework that also allows me to share some stories and experiences that I've gained from over 30 years of being in public library management and also dealing with other nonprofit boards And also as a consultant, I now work with Library Strategies of St. Paul, Minnesota, and I've done consulting work in the past over the years. There is a handout that was made available that connects to the slides with my major talking points. We'll make sure that you get that afterwards if you don't have it now. I am going to cover both introductory and advanced topics. So hopefully there's something of use to those of you who are new trustees and to those of you who are experienced. And I do want to emphasize that I know your governance models in your libraries are different. I have been the director of a library that had a more advisory board. SCLO Library, where I retired last year, they had a board that had more authority. And we're going to try to cover the full range of responsibility in my comments today. But before we get started, if you could launch poll number 1, I'd like to hear from all of you what you think the number 1 job of a trustee is. What is the number 1 job? I'll give you just a few seconds here to think of what's at the top of your mind. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We'll end the poll. Wow, you're a good class. 92% of you answered the right thing. Advocate for your library. And we're going to talk about this more as the day unfolds. Now, those other things are also trustee duties. But if you had to boil it down to one thing, and one thing you should listen for today, it's how to be an advocate or a booster for your library. So let's get started here. The 4 roles of being a trustee are as follows. The one I'll talk the most about today is booster. Boosters are the energetic, enthusiastic supporters of their libraries. Now, interestingly, a secondary definition of the word booster in Webster's is it's an electrical device that can increase or decrease energy. And boy, that is true of trustees and the institutions that they govern. The next role is that of a strategist. Your job is to think more about the big picture instead of the minutia of daily operations. Also think of yourself as like a navigator. So we'll explore that role. And we'll also get into your role as a counselor. When trustees support and nurture the staff in their work, that's when you will see a well-functioning library. And you'll learn ways today that you can express your support. And finally, at the end, ambassador. An ambassador is someone who represents the library to the general community. Anyway, we'll get into all of these roles one at a time, but I also want to tell you there's a lot of overlap and a lot of connections between all these roles. Now here's a picture of some ideal trustees, and thank you to the Lincoln County Public Library, and there's other libraries whose pictures will be folded into this slide deck today. We're going to talk about being a booster, an energetic and enthusiastic supporter. You're a rocket engine, which is a source of thrust or a device to help move a train. Let's explore all of this in detail. The state documents tell library trustees that their role is, and this is here in the orange, to adopt programs, policies, and regulations. And you also have a job to establish fines and fees. To paraphrase, your job as trustees is to assist knowledgeable library staff in developing policies, budgets, and you need to support and direct management initiatives and decisions. Now, when I say support management decisions, let me be clear here. It does not mean rubber stamping everything that the library director brings to the meeting. In fact, if you have a disagreement or a question, you should bring it up at a library board meeting because it helps management down the line. And here's my first story. Back in 2018, we noticed at SCLO Library that summer reading participation levels were dropping a bit. And as we tried to think of ways that we could get more families to enroll, the children's department suggested that for the summer, we drop the charging of overdue fines on books and other materials. By the way, everyone, the dropping of fines, overdue fines, is a huge trend in our nation. It's sad to admit that many of our libraries depend on income from overdue fines, but we've known since the 80s, academic studies were done that showed that fines and fees are a real barrier to library use, especially for low-income families. I'm talking about fines and fees at SCLO Library, and in 2018, the library board had a discussion about whether or not to cancel fines for summer in an effort to get more people enrolled in the summer reading program. Canceling overdue fines or eliminating them completely is a huge trend now in the United States, even though many of us, our libraries depend on the income from those overdue fines. Well, we had a library board meeting and we asked the library board to consider waiving all fines during the summer. It would have represented an income loss of about $6,000 out of a $2 million operating budget. And much to my surprise, I had a board member who was vehemently opposed to it. I was surprised because she's a very generous-hearted person, but her response was, absolutely not. We're not going to do this because summer is the ideal time to teach children responsibility. They must return their library books on time, and we can't afford to lose $6,000. Everybody else was quiet. Nobody offered a varying opinion. And so we were denied our quest to absolve people from fines that summer. Staff were a little bit disappointed, but this story has an interesting ending. It kind of planted the seed in people's minds. And it was very interesting that in the weeks to come, several board members came to me one-on-one and said, you know, I was sort of disappointed in what Sue said about the fines. I kind of think we should get rid of them. To which I said, boy, I wish you had spoken up at the meeting. As it turns out, during COVID, when we went on lockdown, and then it was like 3 months before we reopened for door side pickup only. During that period, it didn't take long for the library board to say, COVID is a tough time, and we're just not going to charge overdue fines for the remainder of the year. Well, in the end, the library board got rid of overdue fines at SCLO Library, and library use is up because of it. But I'm telling you this story just to tell you that your role as a trustee is to support and understand what management is bringing to the table, but you also have the right to question and challenge. That's what you need to do. So let's talk a little bit about some of these other points that are on here. I would like to recommend that you visit and use the library. I have had board members that would only come into the library for meetings, or at that even once a year. I have another story to tell you about visits. One time, one of our supporting elected officials came into the library and he happened to witness a very heartbreaking scene where the staff at Patron Services were helping a mentally challenged individual. He was well known to everyone in the library, a very harmless soul that had erratic, eccentric behavior that sometimes scared children. He would talk in a loud voice. I did not know this elected official was in the building, but he witnessed an encounter in which our staff were able to subdue and please this challenged individual. And much to my amazement, at an open forum public meeting, they were talking about budgets, and this man then spoke up and said, speaking of the library, I have to tell you, nobody knows what those librarians do. They are a wonderful bunch. They don't earn enough money. I was there and I saw this happen. They act like they're social workers and they do a great job. You never know what you're going to see or hear on a visit, whether the library is busy or quiet. It's a good thing to really get invested in the library that you are governing. Another thing is, let's talk a little bit more about these elected officials, since I brought up the subject. First of all, make sure you really deeply understand your role as an advisory board, because there is even a range of influence for those of you who are in advisory boards. Some of you will be asked for more budget input than others. Some of you may be on advisory boards and you'll be invited to give input on the library director's annual evaluation. Others of you will be ignored. I want to give you an extreme example of why you should get to know your government body and elected officials. This is from my days at the Hershey Public Library. Yes, Hershey, Pennsylvania. Some of you may have visited there. It is the home of Hershey Candy Company, Chocolate World, and Hershey Park Amusement Park. Anyway, one of our elected officials decided to book the meeting room for a meeting of his party, his political party. And the meeting started at 7 p.m. and he was warned by the library staff that the meeting room policy said all meetings must end when the library closes. So he was told, you're going to have 1 hour, the library closes at 8 o'clock. He got me on the phone and said, my meeting's not going to end at 8 o'clock. You have to stay open. We're done when we're done. Well, I said, I told you, meeting policy is such and such. And I said, there may be some questions from people about making exceptions. Well, I'm an elected official. The meeting's going to be done when it's done. So I instructed our staff to stay overtime, and I did alert the township manager and the library board president. And the library board president said to me, Cathi, don't make a fuss about this. Just let them have their meeting. I am pleased to say that it didn't happen again. I think the township manager very wisely pointed out to him that the public would not be too pleased if they heard or saw a meeting going past the library's closing time when their own group didn't have a chance to do it. But Hershey was clearly an environment where the elected officials felt they were the boss of the library and they were going to tell us what to do. And I had to work closely with the board to understand what that really, really meant. Another thing about elected officials, I hope this is not happening in North Carolina, but we have cases here in Pennsylvania where elected officials who are opposed to public libraries and the funding of their operations actually appoint themselves to be on boards, or they appoint citizens that sound exactly like them. That can happen, and you need to know who the library advocates are and who the people are that are speaking out against libraries. The next thing I'd like to comment on is that whether you're a new or experienced trustee, there's no such thing as a stupid question. One thing librarians are good at, we love acronyms. OCLC, ILL, LSTA's already been mentioned, ALA, E-rate. What's all of that? Make sure you ask us, because we use acronyms and jargon all the time that you may not fully understand or remember from meeting to meeting. And for those of you who are new, you can be a great booster trustee by pairing up with a mentor or a more experienced board member. Some boards do that formally. They'll make assignments at meetings, pairing the new folks up with experienced ones. If your board hasn't done this, at least reach out to one of the officers or someone else, that they can be someone who coaches you or fills you in on things in between meetings. Now I'd like to launch another poll. This is sort of like a little test for you. And this is about something called a consent agenda. What's your best guess of what a consent agenda is? This may be something you've never heard of. A decision requiring unanimous votes, a grouping of routine meeting actions. Is it a meeting where everybody has to speak up? Or is it the legal record of a meeting? Let's see what you all say. Just a few more seconds here. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We'll end the poll and we'll see what the results are. 54% of you got the correct answer. A consent agenda is a grouping of routine meeting actions into one single vote. And I'll talk about this in just a little bit as we go through the points in this slide. Just yesterday, I was at an event and talking to several people in my community that are active on a number of boards, and some of them are very prestigious boards of large nonprofits. And I said, I'm going to be talking to library trustees. What do you guys think the most important thing is for a board member to do? And much to my surprise, they answered about something that is really elementary, but it's worth me telling you about today. And that is, be an engaged and informed trustee, make your meetings matter, and be prepared for them. Here are 4 steps in being a good trustee and meeting this standard. First of all, on all the boards I've been on, there's always been at least one board member who is totally disorganized. They don't know where the key documents are, like the bylaws or the North Carolina Public Library Standards. They don't know where any of this is. They've never printed it out. They've never put it on their computer. Try to get all these tools organized. Secondly, make sure that you master the online tools that your board is using, whether it's meeting via Zoom or Microsoft Teams. Also, there are many boards that have software where all those important board documents are stored for you. It could be in a Google Drive folder. It could be on Slack. It could be, again, a Microsoft product. It doesn't matter. But if you're having trouble with the online tools, go into the library. The librarians would be glad to help you. But you really need to master those tools so that you can dispatch all of your trustees' duties. Secondly, just make sure you read the packet and not 5 minutes before the meeting starts, because you want to be able to give some thoughtful and informed opinions. And it really helps to do that in a relaxed manner. Another thing I'd like to advise you about is that silence equals agreement. If you're an introvert, and I get it because I'm actually an introvert, they call people like me extroverted introverts, but I don't always like to speak up at meetings either. Remember the story I told you about the fines and fees? There were a couple trustees who that night did not disagree with the woman who did not want to cancel fines. When your silence is present, it's interpreted as agreement with what the talkative people are saying. Nobody knows that you have a feeling to the contrary unless you speak up. So please be aware of that and try to make an effort to speak up at every meeting. The last point I have for you being a booster and participating in meaningful meetings are these 3 things. I learned a great technique from another great board president by the name of Cathi. She used to be an employee for NPR station in Harrisburg. She would begin every meeting with something called a mission moment. And I've employed this in every board that I've been in ever since. A mission moment is a very, very quick story about some heartwarming or positive thing that happened at the library. Or if there isn't one at hand, an inspirational quote about reading or libraries and how important they are to people. By beginning a meeting with a mission moment like this, it grounds everybody. It's sort of like the deep collective breath that you all take as you enter the business of the evening. It sets a positive mood and a tone. So that's a little tip that I recommend you consider. Consent agenda is the other thing. Many meetings, they have a motion to approve the minutes. Then there's another motion to approve the ledger report. And then there's another motion to approve the committee reports. A consent agenda is a legal way for you to say, let's talk about the items in our consent agenda. Does anyone have any changes or comments about the minutes, voucher report, or committee reports? There's a little discussion, one motion, and boom, you've taken care of 3 things with one motion. So consider a consent agenda. Consent agendas do not necessarily shut down discussion, but it's a little easier to manage the meeting that way. And the last thing I'll say, and I'll repeat this again, you want your meetings to have a future focus. Now, I have served on some local nonprofit boards where the board consisted of people giving, they were literally reading out loud reports of what had happened in the past month. I didn't find those meetings very interesting, nor were they inspiring. I could have very easily read a report of what happened in the past month. What you need to be talking about, what's the future of the library? What's coming around the bend? What do we need to be prepared for? Pretend for a moment that you're on the library's finance committee. Instead of just looking at what the past month's expenditures and income levels were, you might need to be talking about whether or not we're heading into a recession and what do the interest rates look like for that reserve fund that the library has. The past can be read about, the future needs to be discussed. You're a good trustee if your meetings are future focused. Now the story I'm going to tell you, it's a bit more controversial topic, but it illustrates how boards can be boosters. I'm assuming that most of you have heard about drag queen story times. If you haven't, they've been around for a number of years. And drag queen story times are story times for children where people who are dressed in drag costumes read storybooks to the attendees. These are not necessarily story times that cover books that deal with sexual identity. Sometimes they can, but a lot of times they don't. And indeed, there was a drag queen story time in a Raleigh, North Carolina hemp store. And then a couple of years ago, we had a drag queen story time in the meeting room at SCLO Library. I'll give you a little history on this so you can understand how the trustees worked with us. I would say back in 2017 or 2018, as drag queen story times made the national press, I got 4 separate communications from library patrons who wanted us to do a drag queen story time. So the library management team got together and talked about it. And of course, I was looking for especially a response from the children's department. And the response they gave me was this: Cathi, we're really supportive and interested in this trend, but right now, we're at maximum capacity for our story times. We have waiting lists for all of our story times, and there are so many other subjects that people have asked us to do story times this is going to get on a waiting list. We just don't see how we can do it. And so the decision was made that if any other group in the community wanted to do it, we would make ourselves available as resource people, but it was not something that our library could undertake as an official library program. I did communicate this information to the board, and lo and behold, about 6 to 9 months later, a community group applied for the use of our reading room, our meeting room, to do their own drag queen story time. So that was fine. The children's librarians offered their assistance in finding appropriate seasonal material to read. And again, none of the stories that were selected had anything to do with sexual behavior or identity. In fact, it had to do with whatever season the first story time was held in. But I did inform the library board, and I warned them. I said, folks, we're going to get some feedback on this, probably negative, because whenever something is held in a library meeting room, the public doesn't always understand that it's not a library sanctioned or originated program. They think that we approve and do everything in our own meeting rooms. Well, sure enough, that happened. But I am pleased to tell you that the organization had 2 drag queen story times in our meeting rooms. I attended both of them. There were people that were unsupportive who showed up at the story times, but they were well behaved. They did not say anything. Each of the story times had over 150 people in attendance, and the people who attended were ecstatic at what had happened. They loved the story times. They were all people that had connections to family members or friends in the LGBTQ community. They thought it was a wonderful opportunity for children to experience this kind of togetherness. They had a great time. The drag queens were very entertaining. So whether or not you personally endorse this, I felt that I had the library board's approval and support to conduct this activity in a legal way, because when this group booked the meeting room, they had every right to use the meeting room for this, and to have denied them the use of the meeting room for drag queen story time would have been in violation of their constitutional rights. I'm going to talk a little bit about meeting rooms later. This was a great example where my board was approving. We ended up, by the way, getting only about 5 complaints about the story time. Some of the people who called, when I explained to them that this was outside group using the meeting room, they understood and backed off of their criticism. The remaining few people could not be convinced, and only one of them was really vehement about it and reminds us every year when he sends back his blank fundraising envelope that he'll never give to us again because we did a drag queen story hour. There's no way to convince this person otherwise, but this is a story about how the board was a booster for us as we navigated a very sensitive situation. Now let's talk about friends, foundations, and volunteers. I told you that boosters are people or items that give rockets a lot of thrust. Well, they sure have booster power in Harnett County, North Carolina. Anybody from Harnett County on here? You can put your name in the chat if you are, but this is a slide of their building. The friends of this library, according to their webpage, they're in Lillington, North Carolina. Their job is to raise funds for special library materials and projects. They collect dues, which, as you can see here, very reasonably priced. They raise their money from the dues, used book sales. They give local history tours, and they sponsor author visits and special events. Let's talk about how you can be a booster and support friends like this. First of all, why do you want to intersect with friends? Let me tell you a little more about the national trends. Library Journal did a survey. 74% of all public libraries in the United States have friends. 33% have foundations. About 11% on average of library budgets come from fundraising. Most of that fundraising is done, again, by the friends or foundations. 20% of capital library budgets for the building upkeeps comes from fundraising. So this is pretty important money. Most friends and foundations get their money from grants and book sales. And I'd like to tell you right now that trustees should support and get along with the friends. There are times when there is conflict. Over the decades, the number one thing that friends and library management and trustees argue about is book sale space. The friends run out of space to store the books for the book sale or to sort them. The library doesn't have any space to give them anymore, and they clash. I'm going to give you tips later on how to reduce this kind of conflict. Sometimes there's a more serious difference of opinion, but it is really important for you as a trustee to make sure that there's open communications and no conflict with your friends groups and your foundations. More on this later. Another way that you can be a trustee booster is to celebrate your volunteers. This is a photograph very dear to me. This woman named Shirley was one of our longstanding library volunteers. She passed away a couple years ago. But these are some of my favorite volunteers from SCLO Library. I had a colleague at SCLO who was the consummate party planner. And every year we had an annual volunteer brunch at a local hotel. Brunch is very reasonable. The food is very reasonably priced. But my colleague, Diane Schmidt, would choose a theme every year. This particular year, it was Willy Wonka. She would go over the top with decorations and party favors and all kinds of things based on the theme. One year it was the Oscars and people walked in on a red carpet. Oh, we had so much fun with these. The volunteers loved it. They were schmaltzy, tacky, wonderful events. And these are the kinds of things that keep your volunteers committed. By the way, volunteers are big financial donors too. So the library board always had a presence at this luncheon. Another way you can thank volunteers is to give, for example, service pins when they reach those timely years, 5, 10, 15-year anniversary, even putting a book plate in a book honoring these volunteers. But trustees thanking these volunteers is critically important. You also play a role in donor stewardship. I will talk more about that later. Donor stewardship means that trustees have a role to play in thanking and appreciating those who give both time and money to the library. In fact, my personal fundraising Bible is a book called Donor Centered Fundraising by Penelope Burke. And you will see mention of this in the resources we will share with you. The whole premise of that book is you're going to raise more money if you know how to thank your donors properly. And that again is where trustees play a role. The final bullet on this slide is something that's a little less comfortable for me to talk about, but I will address it. I strongly encourage all of you who are trustees to give an annual gift to the library. Give a monetary donation of what you can. I know that most of you were appointed, probably by elected officials who didn't tell you anything about a giving requirement. Most libraries, unlike other bigger nonprofits, do not have a donation requirement to sit on the board. But by giving even a small amount, if you can say that 100% of your trustee board donates, the big donors and the big foundations want to hear that. And if they know that 100% of the board is not giving a monetary gift, it sort of gives some people a yellow flag that, if the board doesn't financially support the institution, I wonder what's up with that, what's wrong with that. And we have actually had grant applications from philanthropic funds that ask, do 100% of your board members give? So just something for you to keep in mind. We're going to move into a new role now, and that is the role of the strategist. Anybody here from Northwest Regional Library System in East Bend? I love this picture that they submitted. Here's a couple of library users talking about the ADA requirements. Now, the state says that library trustees are to make recommendations to the governing body concerning the construction and improvement of buildings and other structures, and you're supposed to supervise and care for facilities. Well, how exactly does this work? First of all, to be a strategist, you need to know your library's strategic plan. Don't have one? You should get one. A sales pitch for library strategies, we can help with that. But you can get a strategic plan all kinds of ways. Even if you're from a small library, you should have 3 to 5 major goals that cover what the library is going to do in the next 3 to 5 years. And at your library board meetings, at least quarterly, you should pull out that plan and see where you are in the plan, what progress you've made, and you can refresh those goals every year and tweak them a little bit if they need adjustment. A good example might be, maybe you're seeing that the children's room is a little too well worn. And in the strategic plan, you can address the various ways that you're sprucing up the building, and long-term thinking about possibly an addition to that room, okay? So that's pretty much how that works. The other thing you can do as a strategist is to monitor the changes in your community. Is population increasing or decreasing? What are the big community issues? Are they opioid use? Is homelessness increasing? What, if anything, can the library do about it? It's very important for you to keep on track with those trends so that the library can address those areas that it has a view in. I told you earlier about future focused strategic meetings. You want to be having the airplane view and the big picture view. And let me tell you a story about this. This is a beautiful picture of the Greensboro Central Library. And I do want to talk a little bit about building care. The worst example of board micromanagement came about at a meeting in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania. I was there to give them some tips on how to do fundraising. And when they were going over the ledger report, one of the board members started complaining that the library had purchased a bag of turf builder fertilizer for the front lawn and had overpaid for it by $2. And this discussion went on for 10 minutes. Folks, that is a great example of micromanaging. They should have been talking about, is our building attractive? What does it really cost us throughout the year for landscaping? What is the purchasing procedure for buying things from local goods? You know, as it turned out, they paid $2 more for turf builder because if they had driven all the way to Walmart where it was $2 cheaper, it was 5 extra miles and additional time for the groundskeeper to spend. But they spent 10 minutes talking about this. It's not what a board does. You need to make sure that your building looks nice and not, in pun intended, getting into the weeds. The last 2 things I'll say about being a strategist is, you're already doing this one, get training. Annual training opportunities are presented to you through your library, the state library, and other groups. Take advantage of them. And again, making sure that you're cooperating with the friends and finding out what's on their plate for the next year or 2 and how can we really work together. So as we leave the strategist role and head into counselor, I'd like you to launch the next poll, please. And this is a question about, do you know or do you have your library's critical documents? Please take a couple minutes to answer this. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. We'll freeze it there. And very interesting, there's a wide variety of responses. A good number of you, the majority, do know or use all of the above, but some are not sure. Some of you have some documents and not others. So let's talk a little bit more about the information you need to be a good trustee. Now, the state says that trustees appoint or advise on the library director, the appointment of the library director or an annual evaluation, and then this really broad teaser, general advisement. What does all that really mean? Well, let's talk about what a counselor does according to Webster's dictionary. A counselor is a person who advises on personal and professional problems or is the official of an embassy. So that's what you really are. You're an embassy official for the library. I told you earlier about how you can support and encourage the director. Now, a few boards represented here today do have the right to hire and review their library director. Others of you on advisory boards, you're given an opportunity, or maybe not, to provide some input. If you're on a board that has nothing to do with evaluating the library director, I still recommend that maybe annually you have a sort of formal sit down with the director and give that person feedback on their interaction with you as a board. It's very helpful to people like me who've been directors. You can just do a one-page memo or have a conversation about meetings or things that you thought went well or didn't go well, and how each side can communicate to make that link between the trustees and the library director seamless. But it's very, very helpful to get that kind of feedback. I asked my board to do it every year, and it was very, very useful in my professional development. The second thing I want to tell you about is appreciating library staff. When you go in for those visits, thanking people is wonderful. I also want to tell you one of the best things that happened at our library during COVID. When COVID started, library was locked down, and then it was many weeks before we opened our doors to the public. None of us were vaccinated left yet or anything. And the library board asked how they could make the staff look forward to coming into work. And was there something they could do to boost our spirits? And they came up with this great idea. Every week, the library board president, and he collected money from all the trustees, would come with a truckload full of individually wrapped ice cream treats, popsicles, ice cream sandwiches, all kinds of things. At one point they said, wouldn't you guys like to have pizza lunch? The staff came back and said, no, we love the ice cream treats. In fact, I'll confess to you, I used to eat 2 a day, 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon. In the end, it didn't cost them very much money. I can't tell you what a morale booster it was for our staff. And it meant a lot to them to know that the library trustees, we have 9 of them at SCLO, were very supportive of the work they were doing during that uncertain, dangerous time. Doing things like that go a long way. I'll also remind you to honor the chain of command. I have rarely seen this broken in libraries, but sometimes in local government, there will be elected officials who go to the public works people and try to get them to plow their street first or to do this or that. Don't do an end run. Communicate with the library director who will get you whatever you're asking for or you need. But please honor the chain of command. Your major contact person with the library is the library director, unless you've been informed otherwise. Now, a little sidebar here about being a counselor. I want to alert you that there are 2 big things going on in America right now. There is a great increase in banned books in the United States. In fact, the Wake County Public Library made national news when they were asked to remove Gender Queer, a graphic novel about sexual identity, from their shelves. It had also been removed from the Wake County schools. You all need to, right now, if you are not familiar with them, look at your collection development policies, your intellectual freedom policies, and the procedures used in your library when a member of the community asks for a material or an item to be removed from the shelves. There's a tsunami of these requests happening. If it hasn't happened yet, it will be. 1619 Project is another one of the books, one of the most banned ones in the country at the moment. Please also know, as I touched on earlier, religious and political groups can book a library meeting room. They have a constitutional right to do so. I know what I'm talking about. In the 1990s, I had to deal with white supremacist groups using the meeting rooms at the Dauphin County Library System. At the same time, the Ku Klux Klan was using library property in York County, Pennsylvania. You have to manage these things very carefully. Know your policies now before these conflicts occur. Look at page 25 of the North Carolina Trustee Manual. And I will tell you now that public libraries should own the books that are being banned in local schools, as long as they meet your purchasing criteria. Page 26 of your public library trustee manual says, no library materials should be excluded based on political or social views. Having genderqueer available in the Wake County schools is one thing. That's up to their school board. But having it available in the public library is particularly important because there is a debate about this book. And it gives people on both sides of the issues a chance to actually look at the material being discussed. So these are important and controversial items, and trustees are right in the thick of it. Be prepared. And if you have questions about these topics, please put them in the chat or submit them to the state library staff later so we can talk about it in our follow-up webinar, June 7th at 1 o'clock, in which we will answer all your questions from today. We're getting toward the end now, and the last role has to do with ambassadors. Ambassadors, according to the state, trustees are supposed to report on the library to governing bodies in the community. How do you do that? First of all, have an elevator speech. You may not have one yet, but an elevator speech is the pitch that you're going to give to the governor if you are in a library with him going from the 1st to the 50th floor of a star hotel in North Carolina. What would you say to the governor about libraries? You could say, Governor, I'm so happy to see you. I want you to know I'm a library trustee, and without us, children in North Carolina would not be ready for kindergarten because we get them ready for their school experience. We're the free computing labs of North Carolina, where people can have access to computers without paying for Wi-Fi. And we are a great link in helping our citizens learn all about technology. Thank you for your support. I just said that off the top of my head. You need to be prepared with one of these in your wallet, because you never know when you're going to be called on to give an elevator speech. Remember back though in the initial poll, your number one role is to advocate to elected officials for library funding. Government funding is essential for libraries. There are additional webinars and resources to help you learn how to be an advocate, but you need to talk about the value of the library and communicate that to the whole world. And when you're a good ambassador and a good booster, you talk it up everywhere you go. This summer, when you're going out to the neighbors for barbecue, or you're getting together with your book club or your golf buddies, and there's a lull in the conversation, ask people, hey, what are you reading? I'm a trustee of the public library, and I'm really interested to know what kind of books you read. Another conversation starter is whether people read ebooks or print books. There are passionate views on both sides. But it really helps for you to do that, to get out and about thanking and retaining donors. And this is now a good opportunity for me to touch on another important topic, which is, how do you have a diverse board? If you're an ambassador, how do you be a good ambassador to the world at large and make sure that your board reflects the diversity of the community? Now, I understand that many of you, the elected officials or another body, appoints people, but here are the steps in getting a well-rounded, diverse board. A lot of boards do something called a board grid or a board skill profile, where you list every board member and the skills that they have. They might have experience either through work or volunteer in things like finances, human relations. They might have connections to various communities, whatever. But you start with a list of skills and connections that existing board members are, and then you're going to see some gaps. For example, let's say somebody has left the board who was your banker on the board. He was someone that could give good advice when you were talking about investments or the library's budget. Well, when that banker goes off the board, You can tell the appointing bodies, hey, we need someone with financial skills back on the board. When you're looking at diversity, it goes far beyond race. You look at things like geography, age, families. Do they have little kids at home or not? What are their skills? What are their connections? I have to admit at SCLO, the only people that sign up to be library trustees are retirees. We have to work really hard to get parents of school-age children on the board. Their voices are essential to being heard. And know that recruitment and courtship takes time. I worked years ago for a very diverse community in New Jersey, right across the river from New York City. And they had a growing majority of Hispanic people that were moving into the area. When we were doing research for the strategic plan, we learned loud and clear that they were not paying enough attention to the needs of the Hispanic community. And they immediately started having regular meetings with staff of the Hispanic Community Center so that they could make friendships and build up relationships and prepare those people to apply for library board positions, because they weren't really going to be able to serve that growing large Hispanic community until they got somebody with a Latino background on their library board. And it takes a couple years to do that. It's not just a cold call to someone you don't know saying, hey, do you want to be on the library board? So I'm watching my time, and as we round this up, I could talk about this forever. Let's launch one more poll. This will help me close out and prepare for the question and answer session on June 7th. I'd like you to pick the one role or responsibility that you think will be hardest for you, and we'll spend more time on this at the next webinar. Is it booster, helping to thank library donors and supporters? Is it being a strategist, thinking strategically about communities' needs and the library's future? Do you have a lot of questions about being a counselor and defending intellectual freedom? Do you have a lot of questions about being an ambassador and advocating for library support from elected officials? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It's a very interesting spread, and we will keep that in mind as we prepare, pretty evenly divided among strategist, counselor, and ambassador. As I wrap it up, let me just breeze through these next slides. This is what we covered today, the 4 roles. We talked a little bit about what the state wants from you, interactions with staff, elected officials, community, board, and meeting management. Here are some links. Again, please look at these resources before our next webinar, June 7th at 1 p.m. And I want to give a really big thanks to Lauren and Linda of the State Library. They have been great partners in this webinar today. And my colleagues at Library Strategies, Elaine Hopkins and Betsy Bartholomew.